Hello, historians. Today we're going to talk about one of my very favorite topics in American history. As a historian, I like to see these things from kind of an above or kind of a abstract point where you start to find content that lines up in a way that seems really meaningful. It seems like it's story-based. So today is that kind of lecture where we begin to explore different moments in American history and we see them on a march towards an end goal. And not a goal in a good sense, but towards an end result, and that is the Civil War. So historians in general like to look for things like watershed moments when like everything seemed to change after this one moment, or we like to look at gradual change over time. Today's lecture, which is a discussion of the compromises which led up to the Civil War during about the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Today's lecture really focuses on those concepts of watershed or change over time. But because of that, even though it's one of my favorite lectures or favorite lessons with regard to process, it is a triggering lecture when it comes to content. Today, we will be discussing themes of violence, violence against women, violence against children, and just the humanity that comes with this era in history. Because of that, I want to give you a caveat and a caution that even though we're talking about legislative changes and significant moments in American history that have a political history, human beings are at the center of all of these things. Every single one of these laws that were passed or compromises made had human effort at the center. And humans are neither perfectly good nor perfectly bad. They're motivated by problematic conditions, right? So keep that in mind as we move forward in our lesson. You should have access to the lecture guide. It's a front and back, and there's several questions that help you follow along. So I encourage you to grab that. It's probably linked in Canvas or you have it accessible to you. There will be moments where I encourage you to pause the recording and reflect or write an answer or response to something we're covering in the lesson. So I want to begin with this image. In some classes, you may have already learned how to interpret art. We may have already had an entire lesson on analyzing, interpreting, describing, and judging historical artwork. So some of these terms may be familiar to you. But for others, you may not have learned this yet in my class, and so that's all right. There are 4 steps to analyzing and interpreting art, and you should do these in order. The reason for this is it helps you to claim knowledge in an effort to look at a piece of art and claim for yourself what you think it to mean and what value you think it has. So you do these things in order. You start by describing. You describe the textual realities of the piece. And that means no interpretation, no analysis, no trying to figure out what's being said in this piece. It's just the factual details. So describing a piece of art means identifying the author or the artist, identifying the title, the date, and what material it's made of. So in particular, this piece we're looking at here on your screen is called The Slave Mother. That's the title. The artist is Thomas Noble, and it was painted in 1867. It's oil on canvas. That's step 1, describe. Step 2, analyze. When you analyze, you're not looking for the story of a piece, you're looking for the artistic components. So you already know that it's oil on canvas, but take a look at some of the concepts that come with artistic impressions or impressions that you're getting. So look for things like light. Where is the light focused? Look for things like shading. How is the artist using lines or texture in the piece? Look for colors, right? What kind of colors are being used? What about imagery? Who's in the photo? What's in the photo or the image? Mood. Is this a happy piece? Is it an angry piece? Is it a sad piece? So once again, do not try to tell the story, just identify artistic elements. So I want you to pause the recording and look very seriously at this piece by Thomas Noble and write down at least 5 artistic elements that you could write as a form of analysis. Remember, those are things like light, color, mood, shading, lines, interpretations of beings or forms. So pause the recording and write down 5 artistic elements under analyze. Okay, now's when you move on into the interpretation phase. So you've had to do 2 things before you can try to attempt to tell the story of the piece. Now is when we interpret. Write down your answer to this question. What is the story the artist is trying to tell? And this is your chance to analyze and interpret this component of the piece. What do you think is being said? What do you think is being drawn? What do you think is being painted here? Who is the hero of this painting? Who is the villain? What's the story of the piece? So go ahead again and pause the recording and write your answer to that question. Now, the 4th aspect of interpreting art comes down to judgment. Have you ever been to a museum, or if you've just been in a store or you've been at a restaurant and you've looked at a piece of artwork and you've just thought to yourself, I like it or I don't like it? That's fine. We're all allowed our opinions. But when you're analyzing art and you're trying to judge its value, it goes beyond whether or not you like it. And it goes down to, what does this piece contribute? For art dealers and people who purchase art, of course, it comes down to the value, right? So the value of the piece itself, how much money could it get? How much money could it sell for? Historians like to think about, what's the value of this piece in the sense of, what does it tell us about this period in American history? So you know, because we've already described the piece, that this was painted in 1867. What does that tell us about the value of this piece? What's its historical context? We can come back to judging this piece at the end of the lesson, because I'm going to tell you more about the story later on in the lecture. Today, we're going to be looking at compromises and the Civil War. Even though the title says Compromise in the Civil War from 1840 to 1860, the majority of our time together, we're going to be spending analyzing the 1850s. The Civil War breaks out in the early part of the 1860s, but leading up to the war itself were just a series of conflicts and compromises that America was doing its absolute darndest to manage during this period. You might be wondering, was the Civil War inevitable? What caused the Civil War to break out? Why couldn't they avoid it? In 2017, then President Donald Trump was talking about the Civil War, and he said, quote, "There's no reason for this. People don't realize, the Civil War, if you think about it. Why? People don't ask that question, but why was there a Civil War? Why could that one not have been worked out?" Well, unfortunately for Donald Trump, he misspoke quite significantly in this moment, because people do ask that question, why was there a Civil War? There are historians who dedicate their entire careers to this question, just looking at the causes and effects of the American Civil War. We've been doing it all semester long. As soon as we arrived at European colonization on what they called the New World, we began looking at some of the distinctions among European efforts in America versus Native American efforts. And then early on, we begin to see some of the divisions caused among the Northerners and Southerners. And we've just spent a unit discussing sectionalism, North, South, and the West. And we've been analyzing King Cotton. So you know for yourself that people do talk about this all the time. Why was there a Civil War? Like I said, historians spend a lot of time asking this very question. And the reality is that compromise was partially to blame for the outbreak of civil war. As you will see over the course of the next couple of minutes, Americans tried very hard to compromise their way out of a civil war, but in many ways, the war itself becomes inevitable and problematic. Because leading up to the Civil War, it was all about compromise. Americans tried desperately to legislate and navigate their way out of this almost unbearable conflict that was coming very soon to the country itself. So I'd like you to pause for a moment and think about this question. In your opinion, could the Civil War have been avoided if the sections, remember they weren't called regions yet, North, South, and West, had been able to compromise better? Why or why not? So pause the recording and answer this question. In your opinion, could the Civil War have been avoided if the sections, North, South, and West, had been able to compromise better? Why or why not? Over the course of the remaining lecture, I'm going to be toggling among images, and you'll see a lot of maps. So I think it's important for you to see how rapidly America changes at this time. Recently, we talked about the Louisiana Purchase, and now you can see just 20 years later, not even 15 years later, the country looks completely different than it did in 1803 when Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. So I want to point out this map. We're going to look at quite a few maps throughout the day, and I'll do my best to annotate some of these things for you. But let's look at some of the areas. Anything here in red or kind of orange was considered slaveholding. So this is American states that meant, everything along the eastern coast had been 13 original colonies. But then as you go further west into Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, etc., these are new territories that were admitted as states. And once they become states, they're admitted as either a slave state or a free state. Slave meaning they're slave holding, free meaning slavery is outlawed or not part of their legislative plan. So here in the South, everything that's orange and red, you can see is slave holding. In the North, everything that's green is free. So they are opposed to slavery as part of their economy and their politics. Everything here in blue is former Louisiana territory that had been purchased by France by way of Spain in 1803, and it's considered unorganized, meaning no one has incorporated any of the territories as a future state. Arkansas territory here in yellow becomes open to slavery, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Everything over here in gray is still held by Spain, and everything up here in gray under Oregon is disputed territory. The United States and Great Britain are really unclear on who technically owns this territory. So here's what happens. In 1820, Missouri applies to be admitted as a slave state. So let's draw, here's Missouri. They apply to be admitted as a slave state, meaning they want to have slavery is allowed and part of their legislative and economic plan. Well, there's a problem because up until this point, there was a balance of power in Washington, D.C. in Congress, where there were just as many slave states as there were free states. Well, when Missouri admits to become a slave state, Congress is unsure because they're worried that this will tip favor into the slave states' hands. Now, remember with King Cotton, the United States, both North and South, were kind of locked into this very powerful economy. And the South was very wealthy and powerful because of slavery and cotton, and the North was equally wealthy because of manufacturing of said cotton. So they didn't want one section to have more control over Congress or the national economy more than the other. So Missouri applies to be admitted as a slave state in 1820, and Congress decides that that's too much of a risk. So instead what they do is they break up this territory up here, and they create a new state called Maine. And they admit Maine as a free state in 1821 in order to balance out Missouri. So in 1820 and 1821, the first Missouri Compromise is that Missouri will be admitted as a state, as will Maine, so that evens out the plan. But then there's one other thing they decide to do. They decide that in order to avoid this as a future problem, they're going to draw a line across the United States. So any future territory that wants to be admitted as a state has to just essentially be automatic. See, Missouri is technically north of this line. So they thought, well, here's what we'll do. Along this line right here, that's called the 3630 compromise, everything that's south will be admitted automatically as a state if they apply for statehood, and they will automatically be considered a slave state, period. Anything admitted north can be admitted automatically as a free state, and there's really no negotiation. Well, this little area right here, it's the 1820s. It's not quite America's territory yet, but they have their eyes on the prize. So they're looking forward to the future of potentially having future states that will be incorporated, and they decide to just establish a plan from the beginning. North is going to be free, south is going to be slave, and the 3630 line is going to determine all of this. So here we have another map of the Compromise of 1820, and you can see that 3630 parallel line. So there are two presidents who really play a key role in this time. The first is James Polk. James Polk is an expansionist. He's a guy who really sets his sights on the West, and he wants to claim all territories west of Louisiana Purchase. And he really kind of spearheads that campaign for, like, he called it Sea to Shining Sea. And that's a term you've probably heard in one of our national songs. So James Polk is a real advocate for expansionism. He tried really hard to be a president whose policies and efforts transcended sectional division. And he thought that the West could provide an outlet for the conflict happening between the North and the South. So he believed that if we incorporate the West and we use the West as kind of our gift or our prize to the country, that the South and the North would begin to get along better. However, ultimately, Northerners and Westerners began to see Polk as someone who favored the South. There's another guy who also is someone who uses expansionism as a way to navigate through the sectional conflicts. Zachary Taylor, who's the next president, believed that statehood would be the solution to the issue of slavery in the territories. He believed that as long as new lands remained territories, that this conflict was going to always fall to the hands of the federal government. So he just thought, let's incorporate more states and let the states decide the future of slavery within themselves. He figured that once states became their own states, they had their own governments and therefore could legislate their own way out of slavery. So here's the problem. Polk is an expansionist. He wants to claim as much territory to the West as possible. So he's the go before Zachary Taylor, and he's all about getting in more and more territory from the West. And Zachary Taylor is pushing the responsibility onto the states themselves. So we're getting more territory accumulated and less oversight by the federal government. Do you think this could be a potential problem? Do you see any potential problems with this? There was a lot of fear that one state could tip the balance in the favor of either the North or the South. So there needed to be a little bit of a balance or some sort of promise that this wouldn't happen. And we begin to see the conflict evolve in 1850 with the admission of California. So think about California in the 1840s, maybe. What do you think's happening in California in the 1840s? So you might know of a team called the 49ers, and they're named after the California gold rush. So gold is discovered in the late 1840s in California. California becomes an increasingly wealthy territory. So here's California. You see this yellow box on my screen. In 1850, a very wealthy and a very powerful California applies to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Well, we have a conflict, don't we? Because you might remember that this line, the Missouri Compromise line, says that everything north is free and everything south is slave. But California refuses to be broken up into two parts. So Congress is faced with a difficult decision. There's a mounting crisis, right? Moderates and Unionists essentially spend the winter of 1849 trying to figure out the California problem. The aging Henry Clay, whom you might remember from a previous era, was really spearheading the effort, and he believed that no compromise could work when it came to California and the country itself unless it settled all disputed issues. But the number one disputed issue is, of course, slavery. So what the Compromise of 1850 does is it admits California as a free state as is. And this is because the Union cannot afford to turn California down. I mean, even today in the 21st century, California is one of the wealthiest economies in the world. It outranks most countries. I mean, California is not a thing you want to turn down in 1850 if you're the United States government. So they admit California and they agree on a package, a series of conditions or a series of bills that are all folded into this package called the Compromise of 1850. And here are the conditions. First, California is, yes, admitted as a free state with no restrictions on the south or the north parts of California. It's just a free state, no slavery allowed. 2, there is an agreement that all territorial holdings acquired from the United States war with Mexico, which had just finished a few years prior, that all of these territories here, which is Utah, New Mexico, and parts of Texas, that there would be no restrictions on slavery or free status, that each state would come up with its own plan for whether it would be slaveholding or free. There was also an agreement that the slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C. Now that's the slave trade, not slavery. So the slave trade is abolished in the nation's capital, and but slavery, of course, continues. And then the final nail in the Compromise of 1850 is that a new, harsher fugitive slave law would be enacted. After Henry Clay died, Stephen Douglas, who was one of the greatest rivals of Abraham Lincoln, he assumed the leading role in this debate. And due to his own complicated kind of backroom dealings, all related to the future of the railroad, Congress eventually enacts all components of the Compromise of 1850. And for years following this compromise, the sectional conflict was sort of briefly forgotten, or at least sort of left under the radar, kind of tucked under, amid the booming prosperity and growth of the United States at the time. So what's bleeding Kansas? I'm going to go back to the line real quick. Let's show you where Kansas itself is, and let's draw it red because it's bleeding Kansas. Actually, it's more like here. This area here becomes known as bleeding Kansas. So I mentioned Stephen Douglas, right? He's a Northerner, he's from Illinois, and Northerners begin to eye the need to get a railroad from the north to California, because remember, California's got all that gold. So one of the best ways to do that is to go this way, right? So this area right here, what becomes known as Kansas and Nebraska, is attractive to the north because it's a place where you can roll a railroad through here relatively easily. Kansas and Nebraska are very flat. Well, the South, meanwhile, has their own interests in Kansas and Nebraska because of its agricultural promise. So this area after the Compromise of 1850 and really after the Compromise of 1820 becomes really attractive to both sides because it's, you know, it's right in the middle of the country. So what happens? Well, Stephen Douglas starts to propose a northern route through Kansas and Nebraska, which is just a territory at the time. And he knew the South would oppose this bill because it would prepare the way for free space, non-slaveholding space. Since the territory was north of the Missouri Compromise line, it was not incorporated as part of the Mexican-American War, so it still kind of followed within that area of the country. And so he inserts a provision in one of his plans that the status of slavery in this particular area would be determined instead by the line, but because or due to what he called popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty is the agreement that, like Zachary Taylor had suggested, states could determine for themselves whether they would be slave or free. So not based on geography, based on popular vote. That's what that word popular means, populace, like you vote, and sovereignty meaning kind of each state has their own control over their own destiny. So Kansas at the time is sort of more likely to become a slave state because it's, access to Southerners, it's surrounded by Missouri and Arkansas and Texas. And so popular sovereignty is introduced as the future of Kansas, Nebraska, and the belief is that it'll just get decided or determined. Well, remember I mentioned Stephen Douglas had his eye on the potential for a railroad going through this area. So he actually advocates for Northerners to maybe move into Kansas and help determine the future of this territory by voting for the state to become a free state. No piece of American legislation in history produced near as many immediate, sweeping, and ominous political consequences. It literally destroyed the second political party, which at the time was called the Whig Party. It divided Northern Democrats and drove many away from the party itself. It also created a new party that was frankly sectional in composition and creed. People in both major parties and major sections of the United States began to call themselves anti-Nebraska Democrats or anti-Nebraska Whigs, and they formed a new organization called the Republican Party. So that's the formation of the current Republican Party as we know it. It instantly became a major force in American politics. Meanwhile, as all this is happening politically, white settlers begin moving into Kansas. And they're coming from the north and they're opposing slavery, and they're coming from the south and they're opposing non-slavery. So they're promoting slavery. In 1855, elections were held for territorial legislature. There weren't many legal voters in the territory, but thousands of Missourians and some traveling in armed bands into Kansas swelled the vote. As a result, pro-slavery forces elected a majority to the legislature, which immediately legalized slavery in this new state. Outraged free soilers like this man in this piece of art, John Brown, who was among one of the most fervent abolitionists at the time, who had moved to Kansas with the intention of setting it free, they essentially went to war with each other. And this is why it becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. So historians believe that Bleeding Kansas and popular sovereignty in Kansas was the precursor to the Civil War because it was very violent. People died. John Brown's he had 5 sons, I believe, and every single one of them was killed in the melee, and it was very damaging to the country. So here's the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854. So Kansas territory, you see it right in the middle of the map, was determined to be a territory that was admitted as a state with regard to popular sovereignty. They can just decide for themselves if they want to be free or slaveholding. And essentially it was chosen that they would be slaveholding. So what was the excuse? What was the explanation for slavery in these territories? There was a lot of arguments on behalf of slavery. Now, I'm going to give those arguments to you, but I'm not making the arguments. I'm not claiming them. I'm just saying this is what people were saying at the time. Racial strife, the expansion of the cotton industry, and the growth of abolitionism really antagonized white Southerners. So in response to these pressures, white Southerners, particularly slaveholding Southerners, but a lot of just white working class Southerners who did not own slaves, began to produce a new intellectual defense of slavery. They tried to really explain why slavery was good for the country and good for humanity. They launched a pro-slavery campaign on the following fronts. 1, economic. And they were right about this. Everyone in the entire country relied on slavery. Without slavery, the nation's economy would crumble, including the North. 2, political. Slave-holding states balanced the power in Congress. Religious. Through the eyes of the church, Southerners believed that slavery was supported by religious text and in fact ordained by God. 4, social. They believed that slavery was a social good. This was promoted by clergymen who believed that slavery occurred in ancient societies who achieved global success like Rome, Greece, and they did so also using slavery. Slaves were provided food and shelter and healthcare and family environments. So those were 4 of the pro-slavery agreements or arguments. But the 5th and probably most damaging and also most pervasive was the claim that Black slaves and Black people were already conditioned to be evil, lazy, and dangerous, and that slavery helped keep whites free and safe from Blacks, while also helping to protect the slaves themselves. These were the arguments made by white Southerners on behalf of slavery beyond just a way of life. So what would you do when a year after gold was discovered in California and the territory applies to be admitted as a free state and a very wealthy state? How would you appease the slaveholding South, benefit the industrial North, and incorporate the West all at once? Think about those conflicts that the country was facing when they admitted California. One of those conditions that they negotiated or compromised, we'll let California in, but we're going to increase the penalties and the significance of the Fugitive Slave Law. Let's talk about what that Fugitive Slave Law was and what it meant to Southerners and why it was such a significant part of the negotiations. The Fugitive Slave Law was essentially this: any runaway slave who could not prove that he or she was free could be captured and, quote, returned to the South to be enslaved permanently. It wasn't just that, though. It was also that northern states were required by law to enforce this Fugitive Slave Law. So it's not just the idea that white Southerners would come north and seek out runaway slaves. It was the agreement that the North would help in looking for fugitive slaves and would facilitate the return of said slaves to the South. Well, Northerners did not like this because they did not want to be implicated in slavery at all. They also did not want to use their own resources to capture people of color and send them to the South to be enslaved. So their opposition to Fugitive Slave Act and law intensified very quickly after 1850. Mobs formed in some northern cities to prevent the enforcement of this law, and several northern states also passed their own laws banning the deportation of fugitive slaves. White Southerners then reacted with growing alarm and anger as the one element of the compromise that they believe had been for them became meaningless in the North. There are links below in the Canvas page that I encourage you to check out that explore the Fugitive Slave Law in more detail. But let's talk a little bit about this man, Dred Scott. I want you to look into, and you can pause the recording if you'd like, or you can look at those links let's talk a little bit about who Dred Scott was. So if you're watching this on your own, pause the clip, pause the film, and watch the other short student films about Dred Scott, or read the links that I've suggested. So as we come near to the end of our lesson today, I want you to pause again and answer this question. In your opinion, was the Civil War inevitable? Why or why not? Most historians agree that the Civil War was inevitable from a certain point forward. Some believe the Kansas Nebraska Act was the turning point, that watershed. Some believe that the admission of California and the subsequent Compromise of 1850. Others believe King Cotton. Others still believe that it happened even earlier than that. So many believe that the Civil War was, yes, indeed, inevitable. And no one really agrees that people didn't try to compromise their way out of the Civil War. So I want to take a look at this painting again. I want to come back to it where we were. Below the lesson or provided to you are two pieces of supplemental information that should be of use to you as you are interpreting and judging this story or this image. One is a poem and one is a brief article explaining who a woman named Margaret Garner was. Take a look at the links provided. Look back on the story that you thought the artist was trying to tell a few minutes ago when you began this lesson and react. Do you still think that's the story, or do you think there's more to the tale now? I look forward to hearing what you think.